Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. We'd like to welcome you today to our Wisconsin Facets webinar entitled Shortened School Days for Students with IEPs. Today, our presenter is Marge Resan. Marge is a school administrative consultant on the special education team at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. She has been working at the department since 2008. Her work focuses on compliance issues, monitoring, and IEP complaint investigation or IDEA complaint investigations. Marge was a special education teacher in the Madison Metropolitan School District for several years, where she taught many students with a wide range of abilities in classroom, community, and vocational settings. She holds a law degree from the University of Wisconsin and has worked as an attorney in the areas of disability and elder law. It is my great pleasure today to introduce to you Marge Resan. Marge?
Great, thanks, Bonnie. I'm really glad to be here today to talk with all of you about a topic that we know is coming up in several contexts a lot over the past really few years. We at the department have provided some guidance for school districts, families, and other folks who are involved with students with disabilities around this topic. And so what I'm going to do today in this webinar is give a little bit of kind of introductory background information and then really go over the guidance, which is pretty simple on its own, but the simple guidance gets applied to very complicated situations. And I know that what seems simple on one end doesn't always end up that way. So I am very happy to take your questions. I would like it if we could hold the questions until the end of the webinar. There should be plenty of time for me to address questions. And I believe that you can type those in the chat and Bonnie will help kind of keep that coordinated. But absolutely, I'm happy to answer your questions. If your questions are real specific about a specific student or a specific situation, that it may be something that I suggest you give me a call about rather than we address to the large group. But again, I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to speak with all of you about a topic that I think is really important. So a few just kind of background terms. I'm sure for most of you, this is definitely already something you know, but I wanted to just make sure we've got this background language. First of all, what is an IEP? An IEP is an individualized education program designed for a student with a disability to meet their unique educational needs. So that it's in writing, there's procedures, there's a team that does it. It's an important document. It's an extremely important document that really is a binding document and describes what school districts or LEAs are required to provide the individual student. What is an LEA? Well, it's the local education agency. And when we talk in kind of special ed law terms, LEA gets kind of tossed around a lot. A lot of times in the context of IEP team meetings and in school districts, people will say, well, this person is the LEA. Well, no, that individual person is the representative of the local education agency because the LEA is really the whole agency itself. Generally, in Wisconsin, LEAs are school districts. Sometimes it's different. We do have some independent charter schools that are their own LEAs. Again, those are not super common statewide yet. And there are other entities that are LEAs as well. For example, the Department of Corrections is an LEA for those students who attend school through, well, they're in Department of Corrections facilities. So they are an LEA and they have responsibility just the same as a school district. Who is DPI? Well, that's me and us here at my office in Madison. We're the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. We do a lot of things here. Special education kind of monitoring and oversight is one of them. We also are responsible for teacher licensing and for other kind of work throughout the education in the state of Wisconsin. And what is FAPE? It's a free, appropriate public education. 4 letters that, there's, again, sounds simple, but there's a whole lot to that. And we'll talk a little more about what that means specifically in just a bit. So special education, what that means under our law, so this is Wisconsin law and also the federal law, it means specially designed instruction, regardless of where that instruction is conducted, provided at no cost to the child or the child's parents to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability, including instruction in physical education. A couple of parts there that are important. Truly, there is no one location where specially designed instruction is provided. The law requires there be a whole lot of options available to where specially designed instruction could occur. No cost to the child or the child's parents. That's that F in free, appropriate public education, or FAPE. And it's all about the unique needs of the student. So individualization is super important, identifying what those unique individual disability-related needs are for that student, and again, designing a program that addresses those in a way that's appropriate for that student. Individualization is huge. So what is FAPE exactly? Well, a free, appropriate public education, again, it's provided, special education-related services provided at public expense, under public direction, meets the standards of both the departments, so that's us, and Part B of the IDEA, which is the federal law that really guides special education, and that are provided in conformity with an IEP. Who's responsible for making sure that students receive this free, appropriate public education? Well, in Wisconsin and in most other states, that has a whole lot to do with where the student lives. Who is responsible for providing the student FAPE depends a lot on the district where the student lives. So we've got this old, if anybody is ever interested, this link to DPI residency information contains a lot of resources, but essentially, in most cases, the district that's responsible for providing that free, appropriate public education is the district where the student lives. So there are times when students live not necessarily in the same district as their parents. So it is about where the child resides in Wisconsin, and that's the Thayer rule, which goes back to the 1800s. There was a case that went to the Wisconsin Supreme Court that talked about children should have a school available to them, basically where they lay their head at night. And so that's the general rule. There are some little, unique kind of things that make that different. Residential care centers are one example. Certainly, when students are in Department of Correction facilities, that's different. And then local jails, hospitals, there's some kind of nooks and crannies and tweaks to that. But generally speaking, the responsibility for making sure a student receives FAPE lies with the district where the student resides. There are some like independent charter schools, and that's not so much tied with residency. It has more to do with who attends the school. If you've got questions about independent charter schools, we're always happy to talk about them. But again, I think overall, that's a pretty rare circumstance. So again, going into more detail about what that FAPE, free, appropriate public education, means. We've had 2 Supreme Court decisions that really have kind of created the outlines for this. The first was the Rowley case that was in 1982, and again, this went to the U.S. Supreme Court. The finding there basically was that the IEP has to be reasonably calculated to enable the student to receive educational benefit. So it just had to be enough that the student received some educational benefit. It didn't mean that the IEP had to maximize the opportunities and the educational benefit for the student. It didn't have to create a situation where the student received, people would use things like, say, it gives you a Chevy, not a Cadillac, things like that. But basically it's a basic kind of floor, that educational benefit. And that was a standard that seemed pretty low, and actually through court interpretations and, different states and different things over the years, it was a pretty low standard. In 2017, we got another case called the Andrew F. case. And the basic finding and holding of this case was that the IEP has to be reasonably calculated to enable the student to make progress appropriate in light of the student's circumstances. So that seems like a lot of words, but what's important there is it is we believe a higher standard than the Rowley standard. We want to see IEPs that are really designed in a reasonable way to help the student make the appropriate progress in light of their circumstances. If students are making progress from grade to grade and, progressing, that's good. The IEP should enable that to happen. If a student has a disability that, creates kind of a different sort of level of expectation, it's really important that the IEP team determine what that is and design an IEP that's appropriate to that student's circumstances. We don't want to see IEPs that, are kind of, that all look the same, that are, determined in any way. It really needs to be, there needs to be a good, solid inquiry by the IEP team into what this student's needs are, and then what are the goals and then the services that the student needs to get those goals. So we're still, all of us really in the country, still kind of waiting to see how courts end up interpreting the Andrew F. standard, but we do think it raises the bar, and we really do think that schools need to really be very thoughtful about the way that they create IEPs. The department's done a lot of work in helping getting some professional development information out there. And if you go to our website and put college and career ready IEPs, or even CCR IEPs in the search bar, you'll find a whole bunch of resources on what we really feel are strong practices for IEP teams to help to prepare kids really for the future that's out there and to really meet that Andrew F. standard. Again, so CCR IEPs, if you're interested, it's really excellent information. So districts have to provide this FAPE. So again, that meets the now Andrew F. standard to each student with a disability by developing that IEP, the program that's based on the student's unique needs, reasonably calculated to enable the student to make progress, documenting that program in the IEP, and implementing the program as articulated. So a lot of what we look at here at DPI when we are doing monitoring or complaint investigations or things like that is how well did the team document the program that the team is developed in the IEP? Did they, describe it appropriately? Is everybody on the same page about what the various terms in the IEP mean? And so we spend a lot of time with that. Are all the required components addressed? And then also, we really actually, our biggest, most often complaint that we receive is that IEPs are not appropriately being implemented. So you can write the best IEP in the world, but if it isn't being appropriately implemented, it's not going to benefit that student. So that's kind of the pieces that we look at all the time. I want to talk a little bit about the concept of placement because it's, again, another important part of really the whole IEP process. And it is really, it has to be determined at least once a year, and it always needs to be determined at an IEP team meeting. So there are things that, if parents agree, can be changed in an IEP outside of the meeting. Placement's not one of them. If there's going to be a placement change, there needs to be an IEP team meeting. So, I think often maybe school staff, parents get kind of accustomed to the routine of having one IEP team meeting a year and going through everything and all that. Well, that is the minimum. If something needs to change, the IEP team might need to meet more often. And certainly if anything around the child's placement is going to change, that requires a meeting. Placement is the physical location where the student attends school, but it's also changes in services that may result in the student spending more or less time in a regular education environment. It's very important that students are spending as much time as possible and that's appropriate for that student to meet their needs in the regular education environment. I'll talk a smidge more about that in just a bit here. So again, I talked about placement needing to be reviewed and determined at least annually, that the least restrictive environment is a huge portion of special education law. So what does the least restrictive environment mean? It means that when IEP teams are determining placement, that they must ensure that to the maximum extent appropriate, students are educated with their peers who don't have disabilities. And again, that's really kind of one of the high sort of pillars of what we're looking for when we're talking about IEPs and placement. Is the student educated to the maximum extent appropriate with students who don't have disabilities? Generally speaking, students should be educated in the school that they would attend if they did not have a disability, unless there are some unique needs or circumstances in which the IEP team determines the student needs something else. So generally speaking, the school, generally the neighborhood school, should be where the child is placed. There are definitely exceptions to that, but that's kind of the starting ground. And that removal from the regular education environment should really only happen if the nature or severity of the student's disability makes it so that education in the regular classroom with various accommodations, supplementary aid services, et cetera, cannot be achieved satisfactorily. And I bring this up particularly in this context because a shortened school day is most certainly a big removal from the regular education environment. And this kind of point alone kind of gives you part of the basis for our guidance on this. If removal from regular educational environment should occur only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education can't be achieved satisfactorily, that ought to be pretty rare. And shortened school days, you are definitely removing the child from the regular educational environment. The last bullet there is that districts need to offer a continuum of placement options. So there really needs to be a range. It's never kind of just one thing, and IEP teams should be considering various options and really having good conversations about why they're choosing the option that they are for the student, especially the further away or the more different that it gets from a typical placement at the school the child would attend if the child did not have a disability. The further away that gets, the more kind of explanation, justification we want to see, and consideration placed on that decision by the IEP team. So now we'll shift to shortened school day, which again, really the link to shortened school day is that it's a placement determination, right? So, and it definitely makes a change to a lot of the things we just talked about, least restrictive environment, et cetera, location often, but we'll kind of cover a little more of that. The basic kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Foundation, I guess, for our shortened school day guidance is that in general, the overall rule should be that students with disabilities are in school for the same amount of time as students who don't have disabilities. I mean, it's a basic kind of thing. All students are students first. All students should be entitled to the full school day. There's other kind of things that play into it. For example, it's really important from a discrimination standpoint that students with disabilities are not excluded from part of the school day based upon their disability without an IEP team making a really careful consideration. And again, so we've heard of things like, the kids in XYZ program, they just have a shorter day. Well, that is not a real good thing, because why, just based on the fact that they have disabilities, is that the decision that was made? And so again, discrimination is a big concern. And also in Wisconsin, we have a compulsory school attendance law, and we want kids to be in school, and students who are aged 6 to 18 are required to be in school for the full time and hours unless they're excused from attendance, and each district has attendance policies. But again, overall, these are the three things. Kids with disabilities should be in school as long as all students, because it's discriminatory in a lot of cases if they're not, and also because, hey, we have compulsory school attendance and kids need to be in school. So there are times, limited times, when it is appropriate for a student to have a shortened school day. It's really, it's a big deal. Having a shortened school day is a big deal. It is an IEP team decision because it is a placement decision, and it needs to occur at an IEP team meeting. Shortening a child's school day, that's again, we're getting further from the typical arrangement for all kids, and so it really should be very carefully considered and very carefully documented. Usually, generally speaking, we want shortened school days to be for a limited amount of time. The goal for the student should be to get back to full-time attendance in school as soon as possible. And again, where things get to be problematic are when, shortened school days go on and on and on and not a lot of review. That necessarily means students are missing a whole bunch of instructional time. And we definitely want to make sure that that's minimized. It's crucial that the IEP document and explain why the team has decided it's appropriate for this school to have for this student, to have a shortened school day. And it needs to have a plan. And we want to see a pretty, solid plan with criteria that we can identify to return the student to a full school day as soon as possible. That we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But again, always should be the goal in the vast majority of cases to get the student back to school as soon as possible. And we've had a lot of situations come to our attention where there may be a shortened school day and, really, oops, we kind of missed that whole plan to get the student back to a full day. That always needs to be the goal. We get a lot of questions about specific sort of circumstances. So before I go into each of these unique ones, the basic thing is if the IEP team determines that for a disability-related need of the student, that the student requires a shortened school day, it's okay to make that determination. So again, what we want to see is a really clear link to this student's disability and why it means that the student has a shortened school day. Some of the kind of classic examples are, a student who might have a medical condition who is only available for instruction a certain amount of time. But, if their condition improves, we would want them to be getting closer to school, getting back to a full school day. So, that's kind of the classic example. But we want to see some link, very clear link to that student's disability, and it needs to be a very individualized determination. So we get some questions. One of them is, what about shortened school days for all students with disabilities? Years ago, we had a circumstance where in a particular district at a particular school, the program for students with emotional behavioral disabilities at the whatever grade level, we'll say, for example, the 4th grade level, those kids all got out at 3 o'clock and the school day went till 3:30. Well, that's kind of like I described before. That's really a problem, for one, not individualized, and really what's the rationale for that? There wasn't an individual rationale for those students, and again, just problematic in all that all the students there had a shorter day. So, if a school lets out all students with disabilities earlier for a transportation reason or something, again, that's not okay. And actually, that's the second bullet point. Is it okay to shorten a school day due to transportation schedules? No, that is not a reason to shorten this child's school day. We know that transportation schedules are difficult and complex, and in some of our rural districts in the state, there's not a lot of providers of transportation, and schedules get extremely complicated. However, and those are real concerns, and we certainly understand and honor those. However, it's really important that those kinds of issues aren't kind of balanced on the schedule of students with disabilities. It's something that needs to be taken into consideration. If a student needs an earlier pickup in order to get to school to accommodate for maybe some, adaptive equipment, that sort of thing, those are the kind of things that districts have to take into account. They can't shorten the day because we can't get the bus there until later time. Shortening the day because of administrative or staffing issues. Well, we can't have the student come today because the educational assistant is out. Well, that's no good. That's not something we should be doing. And really, we've heard of things, and again, these are real issues that school districts are dealing with right now. Finding enough qualified staff to staff all the positions that are available is really a challenge. And so while that is a real challenge and we understand it, it is not a reason to shorten an individual student's school day. There needs to be, efforts made and strong, just strong thinking about how we're going to meet the needs of students with disabilities. And it can't be, it can't be that we are shortening a child's day in order to make accommodations for shortages. The next one's kind of complicated. We get questions about whether it's okay to shorten the school day of a student because a parent is requesting it or because the student has outside treatments or therapies. This often comes up in the context of students who receive intense behavioral therapies. Often these are young students with autism, but that's not solely the only situation. These are situations where a parent might request a shortened day, and, again, there might be considerations. Well, that request or the fact that the student needs those therapies or is receiving those therapies on its own is really not enough to justify shortening the child's day. Every school district has every school district should have an attendance policy, and whether absences for medical treatments or therapies are excused is an issue of each district's policy. So if a student is going to be excused from attendance for regularly scheduled therapies, that's something every district needs to look on a case-by-case basis and apply their attendance policies in a way that makes sense. If there are some options, I guess I would say, that are available. We've seen a lot of families and school districts who are kind of in tough circumstances where children may require a great deal of therapy during the school day, and it really creates a tough circumstance for all involved, because a full school day and then the full day's therapy can be a real burden for the student and for everybody involved. Well, we have seen, again, districts can look to their attendance policies and see if such absences are going to be excused. The other option is that parents in districts can choose to use our mediation system to determine whether there's a mutually agreeable circumstance that can be reached, and then there'd be a written agreement about that. But through the regular IEP process, just because, a parent asks, or just because a student is participating in, say, ABA therapy, that in and of itself is really not enough to shorten the child's school day. It really needs to be about very student-specific disability-related needs that child has. And we want to see a very clear, link in the IEP to the child's disability-related need. We want to see a good explanation of why you're doing a shortened school day, which is a very restrictive thing to do. The last bullet point here is, what about a shortened day to manage behavior or as discipline? This is something we have seen, and we have certainly had complaints, IDEA complaints around this. It's a big no. Shortening a child's school day simply to manage behavior or as a way of discipline is not allowed. You can't get around the protections for students with disabilities that exist in areas of discipline, etc. You can't use a shortened day as a way to get around that. So what does that end up meaning? Well, to have a student have their school day shortened. And so, we may see something like, well, if the student is going through, say it's a student that's got some mental health issues and maybe is going through some changes, and there's some concern that the length of the school day, just given the student's current circumstances, is not tolerable. Well, we'd want to see that explained really well. And then, what's your criteria for having the student come back to school full time? What are we looking for to increase? We don't want to see things like the student needs to behave for, 5 days in a row and have no, behavioral concerns, and then we'll increase the student's day a half an hour every, bit. That's having the student earn their school day back. And if you remember back to the beginning of the presentation, this is really, it's about all students having the right to a full school day. Having a student have to earn their way back into school really is problematic and, possibly discriminatory based on their disability. So really, people have to think very carefully about when they're shortening a school day solely to manage behavior or as discipline. Think harder about what the student's disability-related needs and what are the things we're going to be looking for as evidence that the student is ready to handle a longer school day, and what's our plan for that. We want to see that laid out very clearly in the IEP. We talk a lot about where in the IEP should this documentation be, and the gist of it is, as far as we're concerned, as far as DPI is concerned, as long as the justification for the shortened day is in the IEP somewhere, pretty much anywhere, it's good with us. Now, school districts might have some, preferences, and depending on the IEP software that districts use, there might be some places that are locations in the IEP that are better suited for this than others. We've seen the explanations for the shortened school day in present levels. We've seen them spelled out clearly in the program summary, which is really probably pretty essential that everybody has the same understanding of the amount and frequency of the education that the student's getting. We've seen some explanations on the notice of placement. Really, we need to see the justification, the link to the student's disability, and the plan for returning the student to a full school day in the IEP period. That's extremely important. Now, just like anything in an IEP, you may make a plan for the child to return to school, and maybe it doesn't go the way you thought. You can always go back to the IEP team and go back to the drawing board and rethink that. But what we don't want to see is a shortened day with no plan in place for the child to return. If, what you thought was initially going to happen doesn't turn out that way, that's okay. But then it's time to get the IEP team back together to open that discussion again. Okay, it covered a whole lot in a pretty short amount of time, and I knew that there would be time for questions. So I don't know if, Bonnie, you have gotten some questions, or if anybody's got questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Sure. And I do have a couple for you, Marge. The first one is, how do alternative or alternate programs differ from shortened school days? Oftentimes, alternate or alternative programs run on a shortened schedule, and how do teams differentiate those two ideas?
That's a great question. And it's not one that has a real easy answer necessarily. So again, oftentimes depending on the alternative program who's running it, whether it's a program located within one of the school buildings, there's a lot of factors that go into that. And placing a student in an alternative program is first, just in and of itself, again, that's a removal from the regular education environment, so that's a pretty restrictive kind of thing, right? So just by nature of making that determination that that's what the student needs, that's kind of moving us away from what the student would receive if the student didn't have a disability. So making that determination in and of itself is one kind of piece of the whole FAPE thing. I think it's really important to look at all the student's needs. Now, is the student given what they're getting in the alternative program, is that going to be sufficient for the student to continue to make progress in the general education curriculum and meet the other needs that student has because of the student's disability? If it's a very limited part of time, like if the alternative programs say it's a half day long, well, that may not be enough, right? So the IEP team needs to look at the student's program as a whole. Do they need to supplement it with something else? What's the reason there? Again, there should be a pretty clear disability-related reason for the placement to be made in the first place, because again, it's a pretty restrictive thing. So, the shortened day analysis is kind of, it's sort of, I'd almost say like parallel to that. But again, you're already in a circumstance that's restrictive, so it's really important that the IEP team look at the student's whole program and to see if that program is going to give them what they need. I mean, I often really wonder when a student who, has maybe some emotional behavioral difficulties, et cetera, and they're having difficulty making progress in the general curriculum in the regular school day because of that, then you send them to a program where the day is much, much shorter. How possibly can they be getting all those needs met in that amount of time? So again, I guess that was a lot of talking, but the short answer, it really comes down to there's sort of parallel things. And again, I think the same documentation is what we'd want to see. We'd want to see the disability-related need and the justification for that choice of alternative program. We'd want to see a plan for returning the student and what we're looking for that to happen. So they really, if you documented the same things, that shortened school day question would probably be answered. But if an IEP team is well aware that there is that the day is going to be significantly shorter and that may not be enough to meet the student's needs, that's something that the IEP team should be thinking about.
Okay, thank you. As a follow-up to that, when districts are considering alternative programming, shouldn't they be in communication with the Department of Public Instruction in order to, work out some of these things in advance so we don't get to the level of, concern and complaint?
Well, I mean, I think that's probably, that would be good, right? The thing about it is that, districts in Wisconsin have a lot of authority, and we call it local control a lot around here, but to do things kind of the way they want to do them, or in a way that meets the needs of their students. And, sometimes districts run their own alternative programs. Sometimes they contract with another organization like a CISA. Sometimes it's a consortium of several districts. Sometimes they're, private entities, private schools that they send kids to. It's tricky. It's tricky. There isn't, to my knowledge, any sort of like process or, I don't know, like the requirements or any review process for opening an alternative program. So that's just not something that exists right now. And districts really do have a lot of authority to do things like that. So yeah, it'd be great. I mean, if someone wanted to call me and ask me and say, hey, I'm thinking about setting up this program. What do you think of these things? I would certainly have some recommendations, but again, it would not be a formal kind of thing.
Okay, moving on to another question. Does this include homebound instruction of students? How does that interface with the shortened school day thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is yes, it absolutely does, right? Oftentimes when students are placed on homebound instruction, they're also, it's for less of a period of time than they would normally be if they were receiving their instruction in school. And again, there can be a lot of reasons for that. Let's just kind of, for the sake of illustration here, children with disabilities, generally the decision to place that student on homebound is an IEP team placement determination, right? So it is often because there's a short-term medical need, or it could be that you're working to transition maybe a student with school phobia into being able to access school a little more and you're building that gradually. There's lots of reasons for homebound instruction, and it's a part of the continuum of options that schools are required to offer to students with disabilities. That's sort of separate from homebound instruction for all students, and every district has probably a policy about how, say, if a student that didn't have a disability, maybe they were going to be having some surgery or something, and they were going to be out of school for a while, how would we provide that student some services at home during their time of recovery from that surgery. So it's sort of separate from that, although you certainly can't discriminate against students with disabilities either. The way that I think about it is, again, if you start with the idea that what we want to see for most students is that they're in school receiving the same education for the amount of time and in the school that they would be if they didn't have a disability. The farther away you move from that, the stronger your justification needs to be. And so often if a student needs to be at home because of a medical condition or something, it makes sense that they would not have the the stamina, et cetera, to have a full day's worth of school. So that makes sense. But we want to see that really documented well. There you are having not only a placement that is pretty restrictive in that homebound, that's kind of as restrictive as it gets. You're definitely not going to have access to your peers without disabilities if you're not leaving your house. And so it's a restrictive location. And then if it's also for limited time, that needs some justification too, because that's another kind of level of restrictiveness. So the further you move away from that, the more justification you want to see. So they do often kind of go hand in hand. And again, that's something that the IEP team really needs to think about hard. And we want to see good documentation of the reasons for that decision.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question is, how does this apply to students who are considered at risk?
That is a question that I really don't feel like I can answer. So there are different requirements that are in state law for students who are determined at risk, and there's some specific definitions for that. Really, I don't feel like I'm not knowledgeable enough of those things to feel like I can answer that in a real, in a comprehensive enough way. So what I will say though is that, again, if it's a student that has an IEP, you're talking about an IEP team determination always. So how that integrates with the students at risk programming or status is, again, I can't really comment specifically on that.
Okay, and then here's a different question. Would you say that behave and comply would be interchangeable when addressing behaviors and setting plans to get back to full days? If not, please discuss what you believe to be the difference.
Well, that's an interesting question. Wow. So what is the difference between behave and comply? Boy, I have a feeling that, that's the kind of thing that probably there could be week-long seminars on that. I'll kind of try to distill this down. It's a tricky thing because behavior is so complicated. When we're talking about supporting a student's behavioral needs, it's so important to have, it's so much more than are they complying with directions or requests, right? That's the tip of what can be a very deep and big iceberg. Well, why? What's the function of that behavior? And until you really do the work around understanding or trying to understand what the reasons for the student's behavior are, really to say that compliance, in other words, like compliance with adult requests, et cetera, is the metric we're going to use to measure that student's progress. That's pretty surfacey to me. I never say never and I never say always, because there's IEP teams have a lot of discretion, and there's a lot of there's a lot that goes into creating an IEP, and especially when you're talking about children whose behaviors are complicated. I would say that generally speaking, if we're looking to say, oh, hey, he's complied for 5 minutes, good, that means he can have a 10-minute day. Okay, no, good, now he's complied for 10 minutes. Now we're going to comply for 50 minutes. Compliance is it's a pretty surfacey kind of term. I would really want to know why that's the appropriate metric to show that this child is making progress. And I know we do see that in a lot of IEPs. I mean, so it's really important for IEP teams to think hard about what's the function of this behavior? What's another way to meet that behavior? How can we make sure that we're addressing that function? And how can we see that the child's making progress in, learning maybe some replacement skills or getting those needs met another way, or, however, again, that's probably a whole semester long seminar in and of itself. But I understand that, I would never say that behavior equals compliance or that compliance equals behaving. That's a pretty simplistic kind of thing. And I think, it's fair to say we should expect more from IEP teams when we're thinking about kids' behavior.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question is, what is your recommendation for shortened school days for regular ed kids, maybe those that have separate behavior intervention plans, and students with a 504 plan?
Okay, awesome. These are excellent questions, everybody. Thank you for these. In terms of a 504 plan, certainly shortening a school day could be an accommodation that a team determines a student needs for 504 purposes. And you can think about, again, the kind of disabilities that we'd be talking about. Maybe a student has a reduced stamina because of a medical condition or something like that, right? That could be in a 504 plan. I mean, again, I think that, it's different because you're not talking about an IEP or FAPE when you're talking about a 504 plan. So it's not exactly the same analysis, but I think if you go back to the underlying kind of premise that all students should be attending school the full hours and, the full time that every student is entitled to. And when you're doing that differently for some reason, you kind of run a risk of being discriminatory based on disability. So, you need to be careful about that. It's hard to say for sure. Now, in terms of regular students who are not identified as having disabilities, so students who don't have IEPs, maybe they're in the multi-tier system of support in the school, and for some reason, the team has decided that a shortened school day is part of it. I can't really make a recommendation on that. What I would say to that, though, is, oh boy, proceed with caution. And here's why I say that. Again, it's a big deal to shorten a child's school day. There needs to be a good reason for it. And if you're doing that, should you maybe also be looking at like a special education referral? Is there something more going on with the student that you need to really be paying attention? Districts have child find responsibilities, and it's not, it's not up to parents to necessarily be the ones who start referrals. When you're seeing things like, and again, if I'm thinking about behavior and things like that, behavior that's that different that you're needing to shorten or talking about shortening a child's school day, boy, I mean, I sure would hope that there's other types of supports in place for that student. And, it may cross over into needing to do an evaluation for special education. So that's complicated, yeah. But I would say I definitely put the yellow light on that one. If that's happening, if that's something that you're seeing happening, it kind of brings up a host of other questions in my mind.
Okay, thank you. Next question. To what degree do we consider the safety of other students and staff in determining whether a student needs a shortened school day or an alternative program?
So that's another excellent and very real question. I mean, we definitely have to consider this safety of everybody involved. So it's certainly a consideration. I think that I'll answer this in a way that probably won't be satisfactory, but that's kind of what I do. Sorry about that. What I would say is that, you're balancing a few different things there, right? You're balancing the need for safety, and you're balancing the need for the safety of staff, the safety of other students. You're also balancing the rights of this student. And in my mind, I come from the background of where we're looking at the student's right to FAPE. And I'm going to say, I mean, I think it's a consideration, right? Should not be the sole consideration. To kind of go back to something I said before, we've got this whole, when you look at behavior and thinking about the behavior that you see, some of which can be really very, very difficult and absolutely can cause both physical and other types of injury to people. I mean, it's complicated, right? But what you're seeing is the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole lot going on that needs to be figured out. So, a shortened school day might be something you take into consideration when doing that. But I'd want to make sure, again, you're not saying, well, we need to shorten the day because the student's a danger to others. What about that student's disability means that it makes sense, right? Is the student, is there maybe a condition where the student needs to build up his or her ability to attend to the demands of a school day, for a longer period of time? I mean, what are you seeing the behaviors at a similar time of day? Are you seeing, again, there's so much that goes into behavior, discussions of behavior and functional behavioral assessment and coming up with appropriate interventions that it's hard to say in mind. But I guess I'll err on the side of saying that certainly school safety is a huge issue, and it's something that schools need to be watching and taking seriously. It can't probably to have it be the only reason for removal or placement of a student in a different area. I mean, I don't think anybody would ever really do that, but I think, again, you need to also make sure that this conversation is focused on this student's needs and what are we hoping to accomplish with this school day. It can't just be about getting the student away from other kids, because, that's kind of contrary to what IDEA spells out. It's tough, though, and I understand, and I bet there's the person who asked that question probably has a very specific situation, and I definitely understand that the complexity of that can be amazingly complex. There's a lot going on there.
Thank you, Marge. And then another question for you. What process do you go through to determine shortened school day versus alternative education?
Okay, good question. And it's not one that I have a great answer for. I think, kind of if you look at the model that's kind of, you look at what a student would be getting if they didn't have a disability, all things being equal, what would they be getting? The further away you move from that is the further, the more you've got to kind of really have the right sort of reasoning and justification and explanation really in the IEP, as well as a thought towards having the child return to a less restricted kind of setting or time or whatever over a period of time. So we'd want to see kind of preparation and thoughts and so it's the justification needs to be there and it needs to be documented. I guess that's my bottom line. When I say if you're looking at an alternative placement or a shortened school day, well, again, I go back to what are your reasons for shortening the child's school day? Like, what about the child's disability makes it necessary that a shorter time is going to do it? Is it that, again, we're working on building certain skills that we feel like we can add on to that, and we have a way of objectively measuring that we think we can kind of work on building the child's ability and stamina, and that's what we're doing. So in other words, we're providing the student the tools that they need in order to do a full day or, do a longer day. If that makes sense, then maybe a shortened day makes sense. If the reason for it, though, is something else, then I think, we have to look at why. Again, how is the student going to get their needs met if they're not in a full day of school? How are they going to continue to make progress in the general curriculum? How are they going to get the behavioral types of education or specially designed instruction and behavior that they would be getting otherwise? Really just looking at that kind of nexus to the child's disability is really important. Sometimes there may be a need for a more restrictive placement because there needs to be more external control or something like that. That's a possibility, right? Does that necessarily equal that we're going to be in school for less time? Not necessarily, right? Again, look at what the student's disability-related needs are. A good analysis of that is going to get you far when you're making those kind of decisions.
Okay, thank you. We have a follow-up question to that one, and that is, what is the recommendation for students with mental health concerns, especially if a therapist or a doctor is asking for it?
Boy, that's a complicated one. I mean, again, I think therapists, doctors, etc. If a student has an IEP, they can those people, if the parent wants them to be on the IEP team or participate in the meetings, absolutely, that information needs to be considered. It needs to be looked at. But let's go back to kind of those frequently asked questions about shortened school day. If the need of a student is that the student has to have therapy so they can't be in school, well, is that a situation where maybe we have to talk about whether they're excused from attendance from school by the district's attendance policy, or are we looking at, is there a disability related need to shorten the day? So, I mean, that's really complex. I think what's really important for IEP teams to remember is that they've got to consider all of this information when making determinations. There's never one right way or another, but where IEP teams, I think, where they kind of can sort of go astray on this is when the disability related needs of the student are not well understood. And, we're making decisions about programming and things before we really understand what the needs are. I know that's not a satisfactory answer, but I think, the other thing to know is that there's certainly more, our student services prevention and wellness team here at DPI has lots of resources, and it's growing all the time around student mental health. And I think, I would encourage everybody to make good use of those resources. And if you need some help finding them or anything like that, I'm happy to kind of connect you with the right people.
Okay, I know that our time is running short. We have a couple of more minutes to go, but I do have a couple of more questions if you're willing.
I'm good.
Okay. What are our legal obligations to the student in a regular ed class with a student who demonstrates severe aggressive behavior, like a special ed student?
Yeah, that's again, a real and an excellent question. It's not one that I feel like I can really answer. What I would say is that is the responsibility of school to sort of balance all that out. It's tricky. It's important that the IEP team for the student with the significant behavioral needs meet and be careful and thoughtful about the placement and the program, right? We don't, it's not good for anyone if everybody's, school day is getting disrupted all the time. Something may need to change, but it also, I don't know. I mean, it's a tough balance in terms of things like, what's our responsibility, what's our liability. Those are really questions that a district would need to really work with their legal counsel to get to a good place with those. They're just really not things that we can generalize about because it's all very individualized and very case by case.
Okay, and I think that one or two more and we should do it then. Once the shortened once the shortened school day is in the IEP, how does that impact school absences and or truancy?
Okay, that's a good question, and that's a real practical one, I think. When a student has a shortened school day per their IEP, that is their school day, right? So you wouldn't mark the student absent for those periods that they're not attending if the student has that's their day. I mean, that when that's their school day, that's their school day. So you base the attendance on what that student's school day is. The definition of what a 100% school day changes because you've changed the parameters around that. So kids shouldn't be being marked absent for times they're not supposed to be in school, or according to that calculus. Now, inside of a shortened school day, kids can still be truant and kids can still be missing. And I guess if a student's school day was 5 hours long and they weren't there for the whole 5 hours, that's a full day. So, thinking about how your district counts attendance and marks attendance, it's not really, this is an easy and not a great way of saying it, but it's not fair to mark a student absent for time they're not supposed to be in school, but it's also not okay to say, oh, well, the student missed their full school day, but they only missed part of a school day. I mean, that's not really how that goes either. So look at the length of the school day according to the IEP as that student's school day for that period of time.
Okay, thank you. One last question. What
Okay.
options do parents have if they disagree with the IEP team's decision to shorten a student's day, or if they believe it is being used to manage behavior only?
Excellent question. I'm really glad you asked that. So parents always have dispute resolution options available to them under special education law. So anytime a parent disagrees with the determination of an IEP team, there are dispute resolution options that include the due process hearing request. It includes filing an IDEA complaint with us. It includes the potential to go to mediation and work out a solution that is more acceptable to everyone involved. When you're talking about changes in placement, something that's really important to know is that if you request an IEP, you can always request an IEP team meeting, but if you file an IDEA complaint or you request a facilitated IEP team meeting or mediation, that doesn't change what the student's placement is. I mean, in other words, if there's a placement change that you disagree with and you say, okay, well, I'm going to file a complaint, that doesn't stop that placement from going into effect. If someone wants to stop a placement from going into effect, that needs to be a due process hearing request, and the parent needs to be very clear with the due process hearing request that they want stay put. They don't want the placement to go into effect, and that has a whole bunch of requirements and things like that we have information on our website about. But just know that there are always options, and we look at those complaints all the time.
Well, thank you so very much, Marge, and thank you to all of those people who had given us your questions today. This was a great, great interactive meeting, and I thank you to very much, Marge, for your candidness in answering all these questions. We greatly appreciate that. Do you have a closing statement for us?
I guess what I'll say is that, I mean, I know that these are not easy issues, and they're never easy issues, and they require a lot of creativity, a lot of energy, and just a belief that all of our students can and do and will learn, no matter what the circumstances. And so it's really we need to take these challenges on with the right amount of creativity and just belief in our students. And also, I know this is not easy work, and folks who are in the field and parents who are learning about all of these things, because it's something you never expected to have to learn. I mean, again, my heart is with all of you, and I know that everybody, you would never be in it if you weren't looking out for wanting the right thing for kids. So I appreciate the work that you do, and I appreciate parents out there, and I really appreciate the great questions. This was a great session. There were some totally great questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you,
It was
Mark.
fun.
And thank you to everybody who participated today. This concludes our webinar. Please be reminded that Wisconsin Facets has over 80 scheduled trainings and webinars for 2020. Please check our website calendar and register for any of the upcoming trainings that you may be interested in. And also please watch for the short evaluation that will be coming your way after today's live webinar. Thank you again, Marge, and thank you to all of
You're
you
welcome.
who participated. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.